All right, good morning, folks. This next lesson here is about paper making. I've got a PowerPoint presentation that works, but for some reason I can't get the slides presentation in Google to work with the audio. So I'm just going to do a video here for you guys real quick. Let's just follow along. And at the end of this presentation, there's going to be 3 videos you're going to have to watch, which I'll have in Classroom. And then there's a small little worksheet that you have to complete as well. All right, so here we go. So we're going to go over some glossary of terms, build the pour mold, make the pulp, pour the pulp, and how to couch or couch the sheet, which is basically flatten it out and dry it. You'll use a sponge to do the drying process. You're going to dry the paper overnight. Variations of paper and shades, and variations of embedded items of things that you can do. This process is really about how you can make some paper at home. So mold and decal, the frame that is used to make the paper. The mold is the bottom portion, which includes a stiff mesh that is a screen. The decal is the top portion. So that's just a little explanation of that. Ragged edges are also called decal in paper making. Couching, the paper is really basically to lay it flat and get the drying process and getting it off the mesh onto some felt paper or something that's dry. Felts, sometimes called couching the sheets. These are pieces of material used to separate sheets of wet paper. And you'll see through this exercise how I did it at home. And then pulp is basically mixing water and plant fibers that your paper is made of. And most of the time it's made out of some sort of trees, pine trees, and then some hardwood trees like oak and maple. There are some papers that are made out of bamboo and some other materials like cotton. There are some papers made out of 100% cotton. So this is going to show you how to cut the window, screening to size. You'll see in the presentation, and then you got to cut some 2x4s, add some eye hooks to the frame so it all snaps together, and you'll see all this. So this is an example of the mold. I used 2x4s at home. I made the exact same thing at home. It's kind of a neat little process. Window screen is in between the 2 layers, and when you snap it in there tight, it holds everything together nice and neat. So when you're doing this experiment, I'm not going to go through this whole thing step by step, but some of the things you're going to be aware of is that when you're making paper at home, I actually used all newspaper stuff, so my paper tends to be on the gray side. You can just use regular white paper or glossy paper, but you have to understand is that when you process all this stuff, it's going to have an effect on your final product, so you don't want to mess it up too much. Again, you can practice a couple different things, but when you do this process, you got to cut or tear. I tore mine into about 1x1 squares, place them in a bowl of hot water for about 15 to 20 minutes. Prior to putting them in the blender. Now you could just put them in the blender with some boiling hot water and let it sit there rather than like I did. I poured mine out from a bowl into the blender. So this would be an easier way if you just throw it right in the blender. And then when you get to the blending process, you're going to blend this for about 30 seconds to a minute. The longer you blend it, the pulp will be smoother and more regular for your paper. So just it's really going to be a trial and everything. And you can personalize your pulp. You can add a wide variety of materials like you can put leaves and flour and glitter, confetti seeds, and some of the stuff you would do as you're pouring it into the mold. You wouldn't actually want to blend like seeds in that process. So here you can see I get the 1-inch squares and how I soaked it in the hot water. Once you make the pulp, you'll fill the vat with water. So I put mine in the sink, made sure it was all connected, and then when I poured the pulp into the mesh, I shimmied the mold, so I tried to get it to be as even as possible. And then when you pull the mold up out of the water, you're going to pull it up nice and slow so that, again, you're trying to keep the paper pulp as even as possible. And then, what you would do after that is I put it on a cookie sheet, so let the water drain out for quite a while before I tried to handle the paper. So this is an example of what you would do, pouring the pulp into the mold. The next thing you're going to do is you'll undo the latch hooks and lift the decal box. Just be careful because this is wet, so you want to be careful when you do this step because you don't want to pull any of the wet pulp up or the sheet up with it. And then you're going to carefully turn this over onto a felt piece of paper. I actually used a dishcloth, and actually it's kind of funny because it has a pattern in it. You may see it here in a second when I show you the sample. So that's how you do it. Step one, and then you put the felt on it, and then you then you flip the piece over and you try to pull off the pulp sheet, we'll call it right now. You're going to use a sponge, and you just kind of press down on this part to press all the water out, trying to get as much of the water out as possible. And then again, you'll slowly lift the mold off the paper. You got to be careful because the screen's going to want to hold on to some of that. Just be careful when you pull this off. And then you'll place another piece of felt on top of the paper. And again, whatever you use for the soaking up process of the water, if it's got a pattern on it, the felt, your pulp or your paper that you're making will pick up whatever image you have there. So you're just going to be careful when you do this step. And also, you may end up having to change your felt paper or your dishcloths a couple of times as you go through the drying process. So there's the sponge to remove the excess water. And again, you can let this air dry, but again, you got to be a little careful because if you don't have any weight on it, the paper's going to want to curl. So you want to just be a little careful on how you do this. When I did this, I placed it between two. I put some paper towels down, and then I put two cookie sheets on top of each other to try to helpfully hold it down as much as possible. It's worked out pretty well, actually. So there's an example of my paper that I made at home, and you can see that there's a pattern from the dishcloth that I used. You can see the pattern in the paper. I did put, like I mentioned, I put it in between two pieces of cookie sheets, had cloth on top of it, and then I put a couple books on top of it to try to keep it as flat as possible. So it does work. And it took about a day or so for it to dry up. So if you leave it exposed, it'll dry up faster, but the problem is you're going to run into the paper will curl big time, so just be careful when you do that. You can easily, again, you can do this exercise. You can add food coloring or different types of colored paper to change the look of your pulp or your paper. Depending on how thick or thin you pour the pulp into the mold will depend on how flexible or pliable the material you make is going to be. And again, while it's wet, you can also take cookie cutters and cut out different sheets that would be different shapes and sizes of material. And again, it's really easy that the best time to do some of those custom designs is when the paper is really, really wet. Prior to couching the sheet. So this is just some examples that you can do, some butterfly shapes. And if you look at this close enough, you can see that there's some little bumps and stuff in this. And these butterflies actually have seeds in it. And the seeds will allow you to take this outside and actually plant it. So I mentioned it here again. You could take ripped up fabric, you can take leaves, glitter, ribbons, whatever you want, and mix that in with your pulp prior to the couching or drying process, and you'll have plenty of variation in the sheets that you're going to make. Here's some examples here, some flowers and seeds and stuff that you can actually plant down the road. I did something similar to this on one of the exercises I did with my students. We did actually put some seeds in some paper, and I forgot to plant it over the summer, so I'm going to hold on to it until next year and see if it'll grow next year. These are the two videos on how paper is made. There's one on the left and there's one on the right. The one on the left is, I believe, is a paper mill up in New Hampshire, or actually that might be Maine. But there's two different videos here. You're going to have to watch both of them because you're going to have to answer some questions on both of these paper mills. And then this is video is how I actually made my my paper. So you can watch this and you can see how the whole process of how I completed the paper making process. And again, I just used a regular blender at home. So this is actually a little model that I made for my son when he was in school years ago. He was doing a project on ironically, he did a thing on paper. And this was kind of interesting how we did this. So when you go through the printing process of this, when you see the videos, A is the head box. That's where the pulp actually comes out. B is the mesh or the screen area. When paper comes out of the head box, you have to understand that it's about 95% water. In a very short distance, the pulp mixture loses about 80% of that water. And when it goes into number C there and D, those are heated up rollers, steam rollers to help dry the paper, and it goes into those two sections. And then when it comes into E, it's like a calendaring section, and then F on the end is a big roll of paper. It creates a master roll, and they'll finish that up on that end, and they'll take it to a finishing process down the road. So that's a little exercise for you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Take a listen to it, and like I said, you're going to have to answer some questions and complete the report and submit it in Google Classroom. Thanks.